want to thank everybody for coming tonight. I am Mark Hall-Patton. I'm your MC for tonight, as I am for every night. We have a wonderful panel tonight. We're going to be talking about the plants. We all know about the plants. It was originally the plant, and then it became the plants. You'll be hearing about that tonight, and about the donut hole. I hope everybody had some donut holes out there. It was kind of nice. We had donut holes out there. It kind of fits. I'll be introducing our panel as we go along, rather than introduce everybody all at once, so that you don't have to remember everybody as they start speaking from the beginning. Our first speaker tonight is Bob Blankenship. He's retired Henderson Fire Department Assistant Chief. He has been here since he was, what, 3? Two, sorry. You just looked older. That was it. He got here and started by growing up a little bit at Railroad Pass, and then moved into the large city of Henderson, and grew up there. Worked at the plant, but saw it well before that as it was being built, and is going to tell us about seeing the plant being built, working at the plant, and growing up here. So I'm going to start with Bob telling us some of his memories of the plants. Bob?
Are these on?
Yes. I believe so.
Good. Okay. I came here when I was 2 years old, before Henderson was really built. My father was working at Indio Kern making rockets for the war effort, and he heard about they were going to build a secret town called Henderson. It wasn't even called Henderson then, it was called Basic Management, or Basic BIA.
Basic Townsite.
Yeah. Anyway, he moved us out from our home state of Arkansas, and we lived at Railroad Pass. He was lucky we had a 2-room cabin covered with tar paper, like most of the buildings around here were then. They'd already started building a tent city down in Henderson for the workers, and my father got on the list as a laborer, and he started working with them from the very beginning when they were breaking the ground. Then later on, when they finished Carver Park and Victory Village, he got us a room for Victory Village, and we moved down there. So I basically have been a long-term resident of Henderson. I had some anecdotal things about the Railroad Pass. Many people don't realize that's where General Patton's 3rd Army trained. They were in Boulder City, was where their barracks were. But their tanks would roll out, come by my house, and so occasionally one of them would pull up in the yard, the tanker would jump out, take a picture of the little urchin, me, playing in rocks, and my mother would have to run out of the cabin with her little Kodak camera and take a picture of the tank. But there was a kind of a thing there that was kind of interesting for a lot of people don't realize they were really trying to protect the dam those days. About every 500 yards they had a machine gun nest, all the way up from Pittman, going all the way to the dam. And lo and behold, the machine gun nest was always right across the street from me, and I would be able to go over there and con the soldiers out of their Hershey bars. So that's probably the reason why I'm still so pudgy now. But anyway, we moved down to Carver Park, went to all the schools there in Henderson, watched it grow. Then we moved to number 2 Basic Road when the plants were starting to close out down from the war effort, and they were selling it off kind of like war surplus. My dad bought a home on number 2 Basic Road. He knew he was going to work at Stauffer Chemical, and he knew he could even walk to work from there. So after a while, he got a chance to buy a home up on 10th Street that had 3 bedrooms. We moved there. I went through the old Townsite junior high school and elementary school, eventually into basic high school. And when I was ready to graduate, I got a job at Titanium Metals. I was working in the research department as a draftsman. I got hired before I graduated. They had to let me off work to come home for my graduation ceremony. So things were pretty lackadaisical back in those days. People were friendly, and everybody took care of one another. A lot of friends in Henderson. But I was lucky. I became a metallurgical research technician there, and I worked in several of the labs on titanium metals. And I was on part of the team that developed the heat shields for the Mercury and Gemini capsules. Anybody remember those? Yeah? Okay. I even had, when John Glenn's heat shield came back to my test lab, I even had a piece of it that I kept, but I think I showed it too many times at parties, and it disappeared. So, but I got kind of bored working in the labs, because seemed like I was locked up and doing very boring work, testing metals and making sure that the titanium came out the way it was supposed to come out. But anyway, my brother was a sergeant on the police department. I don't know how many of you can remember the first police station they had in Henderson. It was a little wood frame building that's set where the Rainbow Club is now. Yep. And the kids used to do terrible tricks. The cop would be in there, they're supposed to be manning the radio, and they would jack up his car and take his tires off. You know? So, of course, I didn't do anything like that. But anyway, I got bored on working for Time Met, and I went to become a police officer because my brother was a sergeant. I used to ride around with him and loved that. And they said, okay, when I got the oral board, says I was number one on the list, they said, we can't hire you because your brother's a supervisor. So he said, go see the fire chief. He's looking for a good man. So I said, okay. And that started a 29-year career. I ended up as a chief officer on the fire department. And I was there when the town was really still small, and the fire department, I always felt, we worked for you people. You paid our wages with your taxes, and if your hot water heater sprung a leak, we'd go over, turn off your water, swamp out your house, even pull up your rugs and take them outside and dry them. We helped the people. But, you know, as the town grew, the city attorneys come in and city managers. You can't do that. You're interfering with private enterprise. So things have changed from the time when everybody was a neighbor and would help each other. But there's a lot of things about the Henderson Fire Department motive a lot of you don't know. We were the first ones to have white fire trucks. We were the first ones to give IVs in the field. And that was because of a doctor here in Henderson, Michael Ravish. Some of you may know him. When he got back from Vietnam, he was a Green Beret, and I was at a meeting with him trying to talk him into coming and teaching our guys how to deal with bone trauma. And he said, why don't you guys give IVs in the field? He says, we got 18-year-old kids over in Nam doing it. And I said, they don't want us to do that stuff. You got to have a doctor in contact, radio, and all this stuff. He said, I'll do it. The state wanted to shut us down. They said, you can't be doing that. And I said, well, you got two choices. You can either sue me or you can call us a pilot study. And from there, it went on. Dr. Ravish got on the board for EMT schooling and to the paramedic program. And it actually started in Henderson, the whole shebang. I was one of the first paramedics in the state of Nevada. There was 9 of us down here and 9 in the north up in the Reno area. They didn't call us paramedics then, they called us professional rescue instructors. So anyway, when I was chief on the fire department, I knew that we had problems with the plants, constantly having problems. They had a lot of fires. Titanium kept blowing the reactor and blowing things up through the roofs and stuff like that. A lot of it was experimental back in those days, but it was in donut hole situation where it was actually county property and not Henderson property. So we couldn't go in and inspect, and after, maybe a few months of badgering, I convinced them that since we were going to be the first ones to probably respond, they still had a few firemen there, but we should be able to at least go in and see what we're going to be facing. And so they let us come in and pre-plan. But it was the same thing with PepCon. Remember, that's where the rocket fuel plant is not there anymore. They would not let us on the property, even though we knew we were going to be first on. But Henderson has grown tremendously. I've been driving, after I retired, I saw the country in an RV, saw all of Canada, and enjoyed the heck. I've even lived in 2 other states. Been gone for 27 years, just came back last year. And I can't believe how big Henderson has got. But it was a fun place to grow up in. The kids at basic high school are still, a lot of them are still my good friends. And I still have neighbors and stuff that I grew up with here. And I always felt I was fortunate. But you know, the plants were never really too big of a problem, except after PepCon, they moved all the stuff that they were making over to the plants, which was even closer to Henderson. And it kind of worried me. I kept trying to say, why don't you take it way out in the desert somewhere? Because they had enough stuff down there to blow up Henderson. But we finally got them to hold it down a little bit. And then the last administration decided to kind of get rid of the shuttle program, so they're not using the rocket fuel as much as they used to. So basically, does anybody have any questions that I could maybe
Not at
answer?
this point. We'll take questions at the end.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Is there anything else you want me to expound upon?
No, that's all right. Good. We can move on, and then we will take questions at the end.
Oh, I do have one little anecdote. I see one of the ladies that grew up in Henderson with me here.
Ah,
When Henderson was really young, it was all dirt streets. There were no curbs and gutters except for right downtown, around the grocery store, the Van Bailey's clothing store and shoe store, barber shop, bowling alley, and theater and fire station. The only place that had sidewalks. Every kid in town would get those little clamp-on roller skates, and we would go down there and drive the shop owners crazy, you know. So anyway, it was a fun town to grow up in because you could walk from one end of it in just about an hour to the other end. And when I worked at the grocery store when I was a teenager, I got to know everybody's name in town because they would cash their checks and I'd get to know them. So anyway, it's been fun living in Henderson, and I'm glad that you guys here are all Henderson residents, I hope. And it's a good town to live in, and one thing you should know, that the Henderson Fire Department, all the years that I was there, had the best fire loss record in the state of Nevada and in California. We beat the West Coast.
all right. Thank you, Bob. Our next speaker is Doug Haig. Doug was initially with the Bureau of Mines and worked on some experimental techniques in how to make titanium, and then moved over to actually turning that into more industrial level titanium manufacturing. Was an engineer with TIMET, if I got that right. Yes? Okay, good. I was lucky enough to talk with Bob and Doug yesterday. Doug had some fascinating stories, which I was not aware of, that explained why it was that TIMET ended up here, and specifically in the basic magnesium plant, which I was unaware of. It made perfect sense. So our next speaker is Doug Haig, who was with the plant there from, 1954 to 1990. 36 years. So he knows more than I will ever know. So Doug.
Thank you, Mark. Is this on?
Yes, it is. Yeah, you're okay. Just talk right into it.
He says it's on. Oh, that's better. I noticed when I got here this evening that your program says specifically for the years after World War II. But if you will indulge with me for a minute, there's an ironic connection going all the way back to Europe, I think you might know. Prior to World War I, sometime prior to 1914, the IG Farben company in Germany had developed a method for producing magnesium and had built a plant to produce magnesium. And that was good for the Germany and their allies. But when the war was over, World War II was over, 1918, England got the rights to use IG Farben's patent and technology for magnesium. That was part of the war settlement agreement somehow. So, come 1941, which you've heard when Roosevelt signed gave an order to produce magnesium in this country because he realized how badly it would be needed for the war effort. The British then agreed to send their technology and all their drawings and so forth to the United States so we could build a magnesium plant here. They did that, and then this may be not true, but the story I heard was they put all the blueprints and all the specifications for the plant on a ship and shipped it to the United States. The only problem was the ship got sunk on the way over. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. The follow-up is that the next time they put all that material on board the submarine and got it safely to the U.S. Anyway, so you have the magnesium plant that was built here in 1941 is a duplicate of the plant that was built in England in Manchester right after World War I. Thought you might like that connection. Now, one other minor one is that prior to 1931, there was no such place as Boulder City, which you probably know. The town was built to produce Hoover Dam. And if it hadn't been for the power from Hoover Dam, we wouldn't have been able to make all that magnesium because it uses a lot of titanium. Then Henderson comes along 1941. There was no Henderson here, as again you all know. I didn't come until I got out of college and worked for the Bureau of Mines in Boulder City in a research station on titanium. I got caught in RIF, as the civil service like to call it, and the next day went over to TIMET and got hired and spent 36 years there. But what Mark was referring to, the connection between the old magnesium plant and the titanium plant, if you don't know, the original magnesium plant used chlorinators for making magnesium chloride. The ore came down from Gabbs, Nevada, and they would chlorinate that in these huge brick-lined towers to produce magnesium to feed to the electrolytic cells. The refining area, while they melted the titanium or the magnesium and so forth, worked out to be just fine for our reduction furnaces. So to make titanium, you need rutile ore or some other similar ore. You need chlorine gas to react to make titanium tetrachloride, which is then purified in fractionating columns. Then it's a liquid at room temperature. It's clear when it's pure. And then you have to react that with magnesium metal. Well, the plant, the old BMI plant, had magnesium cells, so that made it very easy to switch them over to producing titanium tetrachloride. The furnaces were used to melt the magnesium, cast it into ingots. And then the newer part was producing equipment and a process to take the titanium sponge, as it's called, that would come out of the reactor in little pieces, press that into compacts, weld those together, and then melt them in a consumable electrode arc furnace. And that completed the process at TIMAT, except mag chloride was recycled back through magnesium cells. And what else? So the ingots then that were made here were shipped to a rolling mill back in Toronto, Ohio. And that completed the cycle. Now, one other digression, even though this did occur after World War II. At the end of World War II, it was noticed quite obviously to the military that both the Germans and the Italians had produced a jet airplane. And they fortunately only had a few of them, but they were obviously, they could fly so much faster than our prop-driven planes that I'm sure our military said, we got to have jet aircraft. Okay, so they started working on the problems involved with jet aircraft and found out that ordinary steel wasn't very good for the jet engines and some of the other parts of the airplane. So they needed a new metal. Well, the story is a man by the name of Wilhelm Kroll from Luxembourg back in the 30s developed the process for making pure titanium metal, because up to that point it had not been made pure and nobody knew what the properties of the metal was. Okay, he brought his patents and everything to the U.S. in 1938 and tried to interest in the government into producing titanium. They said, we don't have time right now, there's a war going on, so it had to wait. But by the time the war was over and he saw the jet planes would require a new metal, titanium, lo and behold, fit the requirements for jet aircraft. And so producing titanium then became a key industry. But none of the companies were willing to put up their money and start making titanium without knowing more about it. So the U.S. government started the program under GSA, which stands for General Service Administration, where they would pay $5 for every pound of titanium made up to so many tons. And so any company that wanted to go into the production of titanium could get in this program if they wanted to. So there was TIMAT, which you may recall was owned by National Light and Allegheny Ludlam. DuPont and Delaware had a titanium plant. Reactive Metals in Ohio had one. And so there's 5 or 6 companies around the country that started producing titanium. Well, once that stockpile was filled, the government wasn't going to buy any more titanium at $5 a pound and said to the producers, you're on your own now. You know, you want to keep making it, you find customers. Well, most of them dropped out of operation at that time, but TIMAT had an advantage, I think, because of the old magnesium plant that gave us a leg up getting started on the process. And we've managed, I say we like I'm still there, I'm not. And I retired in 1990, but it's worked out really well, and that's probably enough for now.
Okay, thank you. All right, our next speaker is Ben Sheehan. Ben's family has been around here for multiple generations, and Ben has worked at the plant in 2 different stints and is still working at the plant, right? So he is bringing it up to today as an employee of the plant, but has tales going back through a couple of generations of his family. So, Ben?
Actually, there's been at least 8 or 10 different family members that have worked at the plants down there. My dad worked at TIMAT, He hired in 1953. My brother works at TimeEt now. I think he hired in 1975. I had a cousin that worked there, and I have several relatives that work over at Kerr McGee, and one that was down at Stauffer. So we've been firmly rooted here in Henderson for a number of years. Bob and Doug did a wonderful job with the history, so I'm not going to do too much on that. When I first started off at TimeEt, I started off in 1980 in their magnesium recovery building, which these two gentlemen brought up. And what they had was they had what they called a pot line of electrolytic cells, and they ran on DC power. And back in those days, everything was done by hand. When we went out to dip the metal out of the cells, which we had to do on a daily basis, we had ladles, and we would dip it out, and we would put it in a pot, and then they would pick the pot up with a forklift and haul it back into the refinery, and they would cast 500-pound ingots with it. There was two of them that you would cast when you were casting. First you'd cast the back one, and then you would back up and you would do the front one. Now, the gentlemen that were casting the ingots were actually very skilled with the forklift, because if they weren't, then we had magnesium all over the floor, and the first thing that happens when it gets like that is we have a big magnesium fire, and that burns about 4,000 degrees, which is pretty warm. So, well, yeah, you can't put out a magnesium fire with water. It doesn't work. So we taught the fire department how to put it out, actually. What you got to do is you have to put either salt on it, or you have to put dirt on it or sand. Otherwise, you can't put it out. If you poured water on it or sprayed water on it, it would make the fire much worse. So anyway, I ended up getting laid off in 1983, and I went to work for a mine in California. But in 1991, lo and behold, and the gentleman that called me to see if I wanted to come to work at TimeEt is sitting right here. His name is Ted Schutz. He was the supervisor in the electrical department down there at TimeEt. So anyway, I decided that driving a mile to work would be probably much better than driving 60. So I went ahead and went to work down at TimeEt under Ted Schutz. It was wonderful working in their electrical department. The guys in the department, we were more like a family than anything else. I'll never forget them as long as I live. Let's see, what else did I want to say? Oh, no, I already told you about my dad and everybody else, so that's about it. I'm done. These guys had all the history. Thank you.
All righty, and our final speaker tonight at this part, and then we'll take questions, is Richard Brenner, who is the hazmat coordinator for the Clark County Fire Department. He is also on HICAP, which is the organizing body. It's the committee that works with basic management. That is not basic magnesium. People mix up BMI and BMI. I don't understand why they would. Doesn't sound the same to me. I don't know why it would sound the same to other people. But basic management is the group that oversees the plants, the property there. But he's going to talk about that idea of the donut hole, among other things. Richard?
Thank you, Mark. Everybody hear me okay? Okay, everybody okay now? Okay, perfect. A little bit of history about myself. I was born and raised, I'm a Henderson, the St. Rose baby. So I was born in '63, and my dad was with the Clark County Fire Department. And growing up here, my best friends lived in Henderson, so I spent a lot of time in basic with him, running cross-country and doing all kinds of different things. And we had a big fire here. Everybody remember the MGM Grand Fire? Well, I was taking my dad to work that Friday, and that's what kind of changed my whole career path. I was a junior at Chaparral High School, and the day after, I went to pick up my dad on Saturday. He worked at the airport. He was the only firefighter captain that did not go to the fire because I had to keep the airport open. So I picked him up and he said, let's go over to the MGM. So I went over to the MGM with him, and they were putting a tour together, and he was going to go in there. So he said, you know, why don't you head home and come back in a couple hours and pick me up? So I was kind of bummed out. And there was a gentleman by the name of John Papageorge, who was the deputy chief of the fire department, and he said, why don't you bring your son with you, you know, to see the aftermath here. And it was amazing to see how sprinkler systems in buildings stop the fire dead in its tracks. And so that's what got me involved in the fire service. And I wanted to get more into preventing things from happening. And looking at technology. So I went to school at Oklahoma State University. My background's in fire protection and safety, engineering technology. And there was an event that occurred in I think it was 85, or because I remember I was in college. And they had an event in India where they had a chemical release. It was methyl isocyanate, which is used in pesticides. And over 3,000 Indians died. It was a terrible event. And that's what kind of got my focus on hazardous materials. And so 2 summer internships I spent at the National Fire Academy working on hazardous materials and trying to educate firefighters and preparing them and emergency preparedness. And when I graduated in '85, the economy, if everybody remembers, that wasn't a good time to be graduating. The banks were going under. It was really rough. So I came back home to Las Vegas, and I interviewed with the City of Las Vegas Fire Department. And they hired me right off the street, not as a firefighter, but as a fire inspector. And they said, you know, we're starting this new program called Hazmat Response. And would you be interested in working with our chiefs in developing this and doing hazmat inspections? And I said, yep, that's right up my educational boundaries. I'd be more than happy to. So that's how I came about coming back home and making a career out of this. And it drew me to the BMI facilities. They were, of course, in Clark County when I was working for the city. But in '92, I made the transition. Because we were starting to evacuate a hospital, Sunrise Hospital. They had a chemical release, and it was ethylene oxide. They use it for sterilizing materials that you can't heat up because they'll damage the materials. And they were going to evacuate the whole hospital. And I was driving by and saw this, and one of the chiefs, battalion chiefs, said, you know, you need to go over to the hospital. So I drove over and talked with him and said, listen, I do the inspections at Valley, I do the inspections at UMC. The room is pressurized, it vents to the outside. And at that point, they recruited me to come to work for the Clark County Fire Department. So it was a great opportunity, and I was young, 5 years of experience with the city, and then came over to Clark County, and the first thing they assigned me was the BMI complex. I remember seeing it, you know, it was just a chemical manufacturing facility. So next thing I knew, I was jumping in. We were starting to do, I was working with the hazmat. There was a gentleman by the name of David Faircloth, who was the hazmat inspector for Clark County. And I was working with him when I was in the city to try to identify facilities that have hazardous chemicals. And, but I always look at the history. I always want to go back and look at the history and try to identify, why do we have these facilities, or what brought them here? And what was interesting to me after starting to do research, Senator McCarran, Pat McCarran, was influential in bringing the magnesium facility to this area. You know, basically the federal government needed a facility where they could have an abundance of electricity, and that came from the dam. They needed abundance of chlorine, and the chlorine basically came from the water. And you had H2O is water, and then salt they would get from the Great Salt Lake, and that's your chlorine there, sodium chloride, NaCl. And you mix the two together, you make a real fancy name called a brine solution. Other people call it salt water. And at that point, you've got your hydrogen and oxygen from the water, you got your sodium and your chlorine all mixed up, and you can use electricity to separate those. So you can get the sodium on one side, the chlorine on the other side. That chlorine is really a key element in the manufacturing of, you've heard from our panelists, it is critical in making titanium. It was also critical for making ammonium perchlorate. Remember the Pepcon explosion. So that chlorine was a fundamental element that they really needed. And so that's how the whole process became. They went to the county, and in those times what we basically did in doing the science, and it's happened all over the country unfortunately, is we have a facility, we know it's kind of dangerous if something releases, so we'll stick it on the outskirts of town. And, that's where we'll leave it. We'll kind of cordon off the area. In this case, they put a half-a-mile perimeter around it, and you end up with this island. And, it kind of sat out there. As Bob mentioned, there were numerous fires out there. With moisture, when you get ammonium perchlorate wet or any oxidizer wet, if there's any moisture in there, it can react. And it can, the railroad likes to use a term auto-detonate, which is not a good thing because you just don't know when it's going to go. But the moisture, a lot of times you just isolate the area, let it burn itself out. Rocket fuels, remember, in our air that we're breathing right now, it's made up of two elements, basically. You have nitrogen, 78% nitrogen, and 21% oxygen. And then there's a small amount of argon in the air. But we need the oxygen. We're not nitrogen breathers. And, as you take something up in space, basically there's no oxygen up there. So you got to carry the oxygen with you. And so that was why the ammonium perchlorate was so nice. It had so much oxygen in there, that ammonium perchlorate, that's what it's loaded with oxygen. And even today, when we're launching rockets, you have hydrogen, which is the fuel, and you have oxygen, which is used in the fuel process. And Bob remembers the old fire triangle, fuel, heat, and oxygen. You have to have that to have a fire. And if you pull one of those away, guess what? The fire is going to go out. And, Ben kind of mentioned that, with, you get a magnesium fire, you can put salt on there and it melts and it just blocks the oxygen, puts the fire out. Same thing with dirt. As long as there's no moisture in there. If there's moisture in there, look out. It's going to be a problem. But that was the political process that went on. And after Pepcon, we did hire a gentleman by the name of Michael Cyphers. If you remember years ago, Amanda Cyphers was a councilwoman here for a number of years. And Michael was starting the process of getting the facilities and working with the facilities. And there was a federal law that was enacted called EPCRA, which stands for the Emergency Planning Community Right to Know Act. And it was basically to try to get communities involved and understand what's in their area. And so to basically build communications between industry and the community. And there were local emergency planning committees and state emergency response commissions. That's another hat I wear as a co-chair for the State Emergency Response Commission here in Nevada. And it was all about facilitating communications. And, but, as Bob mentioned earlier, Henderson has grown tremendously. And the one thing we have to do, and time after time we see this. West Texas happened just recently, a few years ago, where they had basically a fertilizer facility outside of Dallas. And large quantities of fertilizer, use it in agricultural purposes. Very similar, it's an oxidizer. You expose it to fire, it can detonate. And it did, and it killed 12 first responders. And so we had to do a better job, and that's what we were trying to do. And we later on moved the blending process out to Apex. with Kerr-McGee. And so that was the real dangerous process that we were concerned with. And over time, we're still working with TIMET to this day. It's a very antiquated process, that you've heard already from the history. It hasn't changed a whole lot. But we are in the process of working with TIMET. Berkshire Hathaway owns the company now, and we're working real closely on looking at that whole chlorination process and bringing it into the 21st century. So, thank you, Mark.
All righty, thank you. So, do we have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
My dad worked at a plant in Henderson that was called pH, and all the plants that you talked about, I haven't mentioned that. What did they produce?
pH manganese, it was called. They had a little operation kind of right in the middle of where TIMET's property is. And they took manganese ore, I don't know if it came from pH, Nevada or not, and extracted the manganese dioxide out of it, I think, which was used in dry cell batteries. Does that make sense? That's the best I can remember.
Okay. Yes, sir.
As somebody who grew up here in the 70s and 80s, anybody who lived there back then, everybody remembers the Henderson cloud over generally the Pittman area. What essentially was the Henderson cloud? What essentially caused it? Any details you could give?
Anybody want to take a shot?
The Henderson cloud, it comes from several sources. One thing, there was generally enough chlorine leaking either between Stauffer or TIMET that you could smell it, particularly if you drove through Pittman area, you know. And the cloud probably was dust, like titanium dioxide is a very dense pigment. They put it in paint because of its whiteness and hiding power. And so titanium dioxide and perhaps when you burn magnesium, you get a white magnesium oxide powder. I'm guessing that that's basically what was causing it.
Was that an intentional at the time release, or was it?
No, it was not intentional. Nobody wanted to do that deliberately.
Okay. Okay.
Was that the reason all the leaves fell off the trees in Townsite?
In one incident, yes, I believe that's correct.
Yes, and yes, sir.
Anyway, I went to work for Stocker Chemical Company in 1961. So I can tell you, at one time we released chlorine into the air on purpose to vent our cars before we had loaded them. I've seen so many changes. I worked there 38 years. They got better and better. That's why they made OSHA and EPA. I worked the ag plant also as part of it, and that was what made Pittman smell bad. The wind always blew that way, and no, you know, I made a lot of that. When I started there, you made $1.90 an hour. But I was happy to have the job, you know. I was 18 years old. They used to hire 18-year-olds. They don't anymore. People don't have jobs like they used to. But over the years, of course, the union, you know, you got raises, and for me, I moved into management. In fact, I ran the chlorine plant whenever we had the incident, the 50-ton release, the big release, you know. But I went through like 6 Scott air packs that night, thinking I could stop it, but it wasn't stoppable, you know. But no, they did spend a lot of money trying to stop the Henderson cloud, you know, and it was, people used to say it was there before they ever built the plant, but I guarantee you But eventually we built scrubbers to scrub the chlorine, you know, so it wasn't, you know, I mean, it just, money, a lot of money got spent. But a lot of people had jobs, and, you know, it was Henderson. That's what Henderson was, a blue-collar town forever.
Okay, well, there's your answer.
Huh?
Would you tell us your name?
Gary Barlow. I lived in Henderson since 1950.
Good. Yes, ma'am.
I'd just like to ask, how dangerous was that when the chlorine for those of us who grew up here? Because they said there's a higher incidence of cancer in Henderson, and everybody goes, oh, well, that's the plants, they used to release all that chlorine. We knew that they released it. They like to do that in the middle of the night, I think.
Right.
So that we weren't supposed to notice what they were doing.
But the cloud was visible in the morning.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but how dangerous was that? Because, I mean, it was thick.
Richard?
Chlorine is very toxic. I mean, if you remember on your periodic table years ago, you have the halogens, and you have chlorine, fluorine, bromine, iodine. And chlorine is a gift from the standpoint of nature on what you can do with it. From the standpoint, I remember, my mom is a nurse. She was a nurse back east when she came out here, and that's why she wanted to be there at that why she chose St. Rose to have me. And there were a lot of diseases, especially TB, tuberculosis, where people would get sick with different things, and they found later on using chlorine to chlorinate the water, basically it went away. And they would shut pools down, community pools, because you ended up with problems. And chlorine, has those great benefits in killing bacteria, microorganisms, and viruses and things like that. So that's why you hear about it so much. But you can also use it for other purposes, for oxidation, but if too much of anything will kill you. I don't care if it's water. If you drink too much water, it can kill you. And in those days, the tolerances and the mechanisms, initially, we had to do this because of the war. And there was a lot of emphasis on this. And there weren't a lot of standards and guidelines out there. And it was a learning process. It was very competitive. As you heard earlier, from the standpoint of different companies that were making it. We were in a race between the Russians, from the standpoint of our technology. And titanium is an incredible metal when it comes to the aerospace industry. It is used in all the high-performance aircraft, even the new commercial aircraft. You've heard of the sponge. They mix that. We don't like to talk about it, but your new airplanes are made of plastic. They can call it reinforced carbon. They can call it whatever they want. But, it's plastic. It's hydrocarbon. And, when you mix it with titanium metal, you can do some incredible things with the strength of that material, especially where the wings are attached to the body. It's phenomenal. The engines and what they're able to do with the incredible amount of heat. So to answer your question, chlorine, it is toxic. It is dangerous. And too much of it can cause a lot of damage.
Is it a known carcinogen?
Not a carcinogen.
No,
No.
it's not. But, chlorine gas was one of the gases used in World War I as well.
Yeah.
But it's not a carcinogen.
But see, chlorine has an affinity to water. So if you breathe in the chlorine gas, the moisture in your own body will make it turn into like an acid. And it will destroy your lungs. So as long as you're not breathing pure chlorine gas, you're just smelling the stink, and it's very, very, after it's been vented into the air, it gets very mild, but you can still smell it. But
Yeah, so it's not a carcinogen, though.
The nice thing with chlorine, it has an odor threshold, a low odor threshold, so you're getting into it. So what you want to do is you'll leave the area. It's like ammonia, same thing.
Yeah.
You can smell it, you leave the area. You put the right respiratory protection.
you will want to leave the area.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell us anything about the tunnels that are supposed to, down by Carver Park, under the plants, whatever?
Yeah, how extensive are those tunnels? I was gonna ask the same thing.
Well, I know a little bit about them. When they first brought the power, the old power lines that go down Van Wagenen? Okay, that was the power coming from the dam down into the plant area. They had a tunnel that went parallel to Lake Mead drive, and in that tunnel was thousands of dollars worth of silver breakers and stuff for the, because it's a good electrical conductor, and they would separate the power to go to each one of the units. What were there, 10 units?
Yeah.
Yeah, there were 10 units. And there was a tunnel the whole length there. There was another tunnel somewhere underneath the old wood water cooling towers that they had. But I don't know about anything. The only thing I know that they had underground over by where the old tent city was the old shafts that they used for the old outdoor privies. But
They weren't for humans.
they weren't tunnels. But the kids used to climb down in them, think it was neat, you know.
Well, I can remember back in the 50s, we were always told that there was some natural disaster or whatever. There was like a bomb shelter, tunnel, whatever, that was down in the Carter Park area, and that we could go there. Was that part of the tunnel system?
There were bomb shelters built in Henderson, but I don't remember one in Carver Park. There was one in Henderson.
Well, there's one to the side of Carver Park. It's still there today, I
Yeah,
think.
But they weren't tunnels. There was just a bomb shelter built. There were a number of bomb shelters all over the Vegas Valley. You have to understand, during the civil defense period, and Richard and I have been out to the headquarters one, which still exists for a little while longer. It's getting ready to be bulldozed now, but it's out in Arden. But during civil defense period, they actually stocked a basement room in all of the properties on the strip. They stocked a room in the underpass on Charleston and I believe Sahara. They would stock any abandoned mine in the area. They had the headquarters bomb shelter out in Arden. The idea was to have stock, water, crackers, that sort of thing, available if the bombs were dropped. And there were ones that, in fact, in Henderson, when they did the first one in Henderson, that was a big deal. That was in the paper. You guys had a big article in the paper. The mayor showed it. Where's Andy? I saw Andy show up. There you are, Andy. You weren't there. It was not during your time. I know that. But it was in the paper. I've seen the article about it. There was a ribbon cutting. I mean, it was in the paper. There was a ribbon cutting for the Henderson bomb shelter. It was not a big deal. This was just something that you did, and it was just part of civil defense. Yes, sir.
What I was going to say is, when they built it, World War II was on.
No, I'm talking about well into the 50s.
You're talking
Oh,
about the tunnel.
no. I'm just talking about civil defense, not the tunnels.
I'm talking about the fact that the way the plant was built. I thought it'd be more about what they paid for, that stuff I thought. I heard not. But anyway, they built the thing separated because they really did think the Japanese could come over and bomb them. They planted water lines that would never freeze 6 feet underground. They didn't build the plant. They could have built like at Stopper, was the chlorine plant was here, the caustic plant was here, because they didn't want to both of them be destroyed with one bomb. So it was always a nuisance once the war was over and you had these long distances and everything was buried deep. 20 years later, they start leaking, but the tunnel went all the way down there. Later on, people would go down, they had hard candy. I mean, they had storage of food and stuff down in those tunnels.
Didn't they have drainage from the evaporation ponds and stuff that used to go down Pabco Road and down into those evaporation ponds down there?
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I will say this also, when I started there, because I'm young, and we had old ammonia machines. We liquefy the chlorine, okay? But they leaked, they were old and they leaked, and you had buckets of 5-gallon buckets sitting at one of your jobs at the ship was to empty this bucket, and you just emptied it into the sewer. I mean, I didn't know, I didn't care, you know?
Yep.
I mean, that's, they eventually, all that stuff got stopped, and they spent
Oh, yeah.
money and they fixed
Oh, yeah.
stuff up.
You know, interesting fact about the civil defense, I was in a 3-day drill. We went into the shelter, stayed in there for 3 drills, and they would say a bomb was dropped here, a bomb was dropped there, and we were supposed to measure when we were gonna get the blast wave and all that stuff. And those crackers are terrible.
Yep.
Yeah. My mother, Katie Butler, was a school nurse at Basic High School, but before she was a school nurse at Basic High School, she was the industrial nurse at Titanium Metals. She brought home titanium diamonds. They looked like they were really pretty. They're all cut. Where do you guys down there making diamonds? I've always wondered about those.
No, but you could order one, and they were real diamonds. They're beautiful, actually.
They were ordered from titanium?
They were made out of titanium dioxide. They're not real diamonds, they're artificial, but they're brilliant. We did, TIMET down here never made any of them because it's done in a very special laboratory, but you can buy them. Same thing with zirconium, you see sometimes. They call them diamonds, but they're not real diamonds.
Well,
But they're pretty.
they look like a diamond.
Yep. Rick?
Who was wondering about who coined the term the donut hole, and maybe a little conversation about what it actually meant.
I don't know who coined that term. Luke, I've got more insight in that, please.
I've never seen where that was. Yeah, it could very well have been Maury.
Yeah.
It's the fact that the plants are not part of the city of Henderson, they're part of the county.
Basically, you got a hole in the middle and surrounded by the city of Henderson,
Yeah.
you know.
I'll come back, but we had one here, yes.
I was told as a child growing up here that the design of the streets, that they were never straight because no one wanted the bombs, the airplanes flying over that were going to drop bombs on us to know where the plants were. So it was okay to drop bombs on the crooked street.
Well, except, and we had this conversation yesterday.
I was told the same thing.
Yes, and I've been here 25 years. I run the museums. The fact is, no, that's not real. If you were ever told this, it is a wonderful story. Except, think about this. If you're in a plane and you're looking for the plants, what is the largest thing that you would have seen from the air? Exactly. You're not looking at these beautiful little streets and these little tiny houses. You're going to see this huge plant here. No, the reason the streets are nicely curved is because the town was laid out by a planner.
By the government.
Yeah, and it was a planner, and that's what it was. But I heard that story when I first moved over here to create the Aviation Museum. And somebody told me, oh, this is the secret. And it was to keep the Japanese from being able to find the plant. And I said, are you kidding me? I'm sorry, the plant's bigger than the town. You know, even I knew that when I first looked at the pictures from World War II. You know, it is a good story, and it's the one that everybody was told. You know, and I understand that, but no, that wasn't why.
It improved my driving skills as a teenager.
Oh yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Back to the plants. My husband didn't work at the plants, but we had the old evaporative coolers, and they'd get just crusty with alkali. And one of his friends who worked at the plants said, just take it down to the open stream that ran, I think it was Bond Road then, wasn't it?
Tropicana.
And just drop it in the water and come back in a few hours. So he took our panels down, which were just a quarter of clean every year, and he fired them to a bush and just dropped them in that little stream. We came back in about 4 hours and they were spotless. I mean, that stuff, that water that was going down there was pretty darn toxic.
Yeah, a lot of people bring their dogs down there for retrieving and stuff like that. Wasn't a good thing because the dogs would get caustic burns.
Do you want to speak to what was going on with that? Is that, one of you talked about that yesterday, that it was, the magnesium, wasn't it? That was...
Yeah, magnesium, guys from the plant would bring magnesium home as a sacrificial metal. If you put it in the water in your swamp cooler, it would stop the rust and the damaging the metal frames and everything. And it would take out some of the alkaline that was in the water.
This was an open stream.
Yeah, but I was just saying, that was one of the things they used magnesium for.
What did it do to the air?
What's that?
What did it do to the air that you breathe? From the swamp?
Oh, no, it wasn't bothering the air. It was just moisture at that point.
It would keep your filters and your metal from rusting, and it would keep your filters a little bit cleaner from the alkali. It would form onto the magnesium.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
For whoever wants to answer this, what was the biggest continuous source of turmoil between the plant complex and the city?
Well, I think I could answer that. The biggest problem we had was, for a long time, they wouldn't let us in there. But when they needed our ambulance or they needed our fire truck, they would call us. But they wouldn't let us go down. PepCon absolutely refused to let us come on the property.
Now, what was always the fire department's unofficial opinion on why the plants weren't letting you guys come in there?
Politics. Basic, simple, you know. One of the owners of PepCon was one of our senior state senators, for example. But they would not let us come in there. Every once in a while, we'd manage to get a hold of somebody perchlorate and practice with it. One time, there's another anecdotal story. We had a fire extinguisher salesman that was telling us how great his fire extinguishers were. And one of my old fire captains, John Farnsworth, somebody might know him, he says, I know something you can't put out. And he soaked some Levi's in the perchlorate, laid it out in the sun, let it dry, and told the guy, so get your pin pulled out of your fire extinguisher and hold it like you're going to squirt these Levi's. The guy thought he was crazy. John Farnsworth picked up some gravel, threw it on those Levi's, and they instantly went poof. It just disintegrated in fire. The guy didn't even get a chance to use his extinguisher. So. Funny things happen in that town with all the chemicals and stuff we had.
Didn't they have to wear, with the boots and everything down there and their clothes when they came home? Wasn't that kind of they had to be sure they didn't have any of that residue? Because
Yeah.
if it went in the
When you
washing
went down to like
machine.
Kirby and some of those places, you had to wear your rubber boots because you didn't want to get it on your leather shoes.
Right.
Yeah. Talk about leaks, they had puddles all over the place down there of chemicals, so it was bad. It really was. The stuff was old, it was built in the 40s. I don't know what it's like now. I left town 27 years ago.
Well, I think we heard that it was a little bit better down there now. Yes. Yes, sir.
What's the biggest, chlorine leaks aside, what's the biggest emergency or disaster that the city avoided that any of you are aware of regarding the plants?
Regarding the plants?
Yes.
PepCon was the biggest, I think. That to me, it was a major event. It didn't affect, well, it affected the whole area of Henderson, but it wasn't in the BMI complex per se, because it was outside the BMI complex. Pioneer Chloralkali was the big chlorine event that you're referring to, and I mean, that was a major incident. I want to say it was around 92. because that's when I got hired to help Michael. And, you know, over the years, most of our events really were focused on TIMET. And I used to have, when I first got hired, it would always happen in the late hours of night, or it would happen on a weekend when I was working on something, and it never failed. I'll never forget my front door. I have a line where I was staining it and then came back and restained, and it just never, you could tell with the varnish on it. And we started working with the Nevada Division of Environmental Protection, and they had a program called CAP, which stands for Chemical Accident Prevention Program. And the gentleman who started was by the name of Mark Zuzzi. And what we started doing is going through and identifying these facilities that had these various chemicals that were really dangerous, chlorine being one of them. And initially, TIMET didn't fall into that category because it didn't have enough of it. But we went back and we worked on trying to figure out a way to get TIMET involved in this process. And I'll never forget, because Mark said, you said you respond to the TIMET quite often. I said, yeah. And he says, well, why don't we put it in the law that, you know, if you have, I think it was 2 events in a 30-day period, you fall under CAP. And that's when we started getting TIMET involved in CAP. And it was a good thing. In hindsight, you know, it put more oversight, and CAP really focused on procedures and policies and how you handle chemicals, and you had to have it all written down, and documentation, and it really changed the whole process at TIMET. Kerr McGee was Kerr McGee's real big in petrochemicals, and they're out of Oklahoma. They did a lot of different things. They worked with radiation and uranium. They worked wherever the federal government needed them. They were first in, and this was, you know, making oxidizers wasn't their specialty, but they had a lot of procedures because they were in the chemical business and they understood that need and that requirement. But TIMET was the one where we always had issues, and they've done a much better job. And now, as I mentioned again, because Berkshire Hathaway owns them, it's a whole different process now. That's a major company, and he's got different standards from his company, and that's where we focus. But PepCon was the big event, if I had to answer that.
Yeah, anybody that's not familiar with the PepCon event, there was 9 explosions. 3 of them were in the megaton range, 2 of them equivalent to the Nagasaki and Hiroshima bombs that we dropped on Japan. We suffered about $2 million worth of damage just to our fire stations. Windows were broke for 35 to 38 miles. Many homes were damaged, and it was such a miracle because of all the damage. I heard thousands of stories from the people. Like, I was just feeding the baby in the high chair, and I took her in to change the diapers, and the window blew in, and the glass fragments were embedded in the high chair. That's the kind of things that were happening. One guy said they moved his grand piano and slammed him against the wall, and he had to go to see the doctor for that because he was all bruised up because the shock wave moved his piano. So it was a big explosion. And like he was talking about, Kerr McGee stored it there more than they had at PepCon. It used to frighten me. And but the only other disaster I know that was fairly big, we had a couple where there was loss of life from a propane fire. I had to take out a bomb down there once, but also TIMET had one of their reactor furnaces, whatever it was a big thing, blew up and went clear through the ceiling in the Navy plant, and that injured some people too. But basically, other than the normal everyday accidents, there weren't any real big disasters except for PepCon.
If I can kind of get a little less serious now, obviously in the 60s, 70s, and even the 80s, there was a lot less regulation, and rules were kind of fast and loose, a little more back then. For any any of the four of you, what's some, maybe the funniest, maybe kind of unprofessional story related to the plants that you can share?
Within the laws of libel.
Anybody specifically under any buses?
I didn't understand his question.
He's looking for what's the funniest story you can share.
Something that you can't believe somebody did this, or something that happened, just something that still makes you laugh. I got one for you.
Up in the office there, they were having a problem with a thermostat. And no offense intended here, ladies, but they wouldn't leave the thermostat alone. So my father was in charge of maintenance down there over that area, so what they decided to do was put a thermostat in there that didn't have any wires on it. And after they did that, well, the problem fixed itself. That's a true story.
I've got one thing that goes off the subject, but people think about the Henderson residents should know that we talked earlier about the MGM fire. The MGM fire was 22 miles away from our headquarters station. We were the first ones to lay lines at that fire. I was acting chief that day. I was on the way to work and I saw that pillar of smoke. I got on the radio and called their dispatch and told them, says, you better, I'm sending a fire truck and an ambulance, and as soon as I get some recall people in, I'll send another truck and another ambulance. And he said, well, we haven't got a report on it yet, so we don't know if we're gonna need you. I said, you better have somebody look out the window. You got a problem. And I was teaching fire science at the community college at the time, and I've been to high-rise fires, and I knew what it was going to involve. It was going to take everybody. And when we got there, I had the captain hit the elevator lobby because it had a glass panel on the outside. There was no command post yet. Clark County hadn't even got there yet. And when we went through the elevator lobby, the guys' helmets were melting on their heads. The cars and the cables were already stretching. The cars were falling. And we stopped the fires from going up in the elevators to the floors. There was only one other floor that broke out on. The Clark County Fire Chief came out for 3 days, got down on his knees and thanked every one of the Henderson firefighters. Because he figured that we saved 5,000 lives that day.
I wanted to comment on the Townsite house that you were talking about. I didn't know if the society was aware that those Townsite houses were all built out of clear redwood.
Oh, yes, absolutely
And,
clear redwood.
Many of the buildings down at the plant are also, the roofs are built out of clear redwood, and some of them have beams that are probably worth a small fortune.
It's the most wonderful redwood that you would ever want to see, and it took 6 Townsite houses to put together the one that we have at the museum. And the only reason we were able to take those 6 is because the Henderson Fire Department were burning down Henderson Townsite houses at the time as practices, and they would allow us to go in first and take out any of the cabinets or doors or anything we needed for the one that we were restoring, and make sure that the one that we had was completely original. Down to, we have an original water heater in there from when it was built, and the original 6-sided swamp cooler on the roof. It's not hooked up, but it's up there.
I had one thing I wanted to add. A couple of years ago, the Historical Society, the people that did the archaeological digs, they contacted me about being a resident of Railroad Pass. Wanted to know where the school was and stuff like that. And they were amazed to find like an old shoe, I was hoping they'd find my old tricycle. It didn't have any rubber tires on it anymore because we rode it around in the rocks, you know. But they did a good job. I showed them exactly where I used to live. It's right off the highway, so. But baby kind of felt just a little old when they were doing an archaeological dig at your old homestead.
All righty, well, thank you all for coming tonight.